Okay, Robert Mendelsohn is our next speaker.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I guess I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm just an economist. Don't know enough about the climate science to be skeptical about it, so I've tended to believe in it. However, what I wanted to talk about is why it's important for you to be thinking about economics and why economics is a critical issue in this debate. If you don't like the climate science in the IPCC, you certainly won't like their economics. The economics in the IPCC is definitely their weakest link. They have not met an economist that they particularly like yet. So what I want to talk about is why does the IPCC not like economics, and why perhaps you should seriously consider whether economics might be one of your best friends in this particular debate. There's a couple ideas that are in economics. One of them is a central theoretical idea. Economists want you to maximize net benefits. That was the logic of the cost-benefit analysis that was being proposed earlier. Why is that such a strange thing? It's basically just saying you ought to use common sense when you're talking about important issues. Climate change is definitely an important issue. It's worth actually thinking about it and not suspending all your rational abilities. So what's the basic idea of economics? It says look at climate change like you'd look at all big important issues facing you. Look at the benefits you get by taking action. Look at the costs. Try to maximize your net benefit. Unfortunately, that is not often done, and it's certainly not something the IPCC is particularly interested in. Where does it tell you to go? It tells you, well, look at how much it's going to cost to try to reduce the greenhouse gases to levels that different people want. Look at what you get in return for spending different amounts of money on it. This is not a question of whether we should regulate or we shouldn't. It's really a question of how much you want to regulate. And what the economics is pointing to is that there is actually an optimal amount where you're weighing these costs against the benefits. Now, it's complicated because it's intertemporal. It's complicated because there's long lags between what you're doing and what your consequences are. But the basic logic of it is very simple. Look at what you're going to get for spending money on this issue. Now, what I want to talk about is two things, is how expensive is this going to be, and second, what are you going to get? My expertise lies in what you're going to get, but I just want to convey what economists think is true about the cost. So one of the things that's true about the cost is it depends on just how you actually implement a program to try to reduce these things. So one of the things that's very important is if you do climate change, you ought to be very careful to do it efficiently. And why is that a particularly difficult thing to do? Because you have to do it globally. That means you need virtually universal participation of all the people that are major players in emissions. And that, in this case, means you need all the developed countries to do it. You need all the emerging countries to do it. If you don't get those people playing this game, it's going to be very, very expensive and probably ineffective. So right from the start, it's telling you something about what the agreements have to be. This can't be the United States does this by itself or Europe does it by itself. It's got to be a much bigger coalition for this to actually work. And that's politically very difficult. So what else is true? What's true is that the more you want to abate, the more expensive it's going to get. So if we just abate a little bit, if we just do something like what Europe's doing right now, we can say, hey, we're doing something about this, and it'll be relatively cheap. It won't kill us. We can get away with it. But as we try to meet more and more stringent targets, it's going to get much more expensive very, very quickly. One of the things about this problem is that it's turning out it's not going to be a cheap problem to solve. So one of the things you got to look at very carefully is just how far you want to push this. How much mitigation do you actually want to pay for? And one of the things that this is trying to get across is just how expensive is it going to be to target different sort of terminal levels of control. So right now, if you listen to what Europe would like to do, they'd like to target something like 2 degrees increase in warming. Some models say you can't even do 2 degrees. That's not totally true. There's going to be some way of destroying the economy that would get you down to 2 degrees. I know that can happen. But if you look at even trying to target 2.2 degrees, one of the things that becomes very apparent is that you're going to have to start talking about very, very expensive programs to get down to a level like that. And why is it expensive? It's expensive because you have to start right now. And if you look at what we can do right now, we can't do anything right now. We don't really know how to control abatement effectively. So if you look at the United States programs, we do this ethanol program, we spend billions of dollars on this. We're not even sure it actually does anything about climate change. So this is an example that right now we don't actually have an awful lot of tools at our fingertips. The kinds of technologies we're going to need are things that haven't been invented yet. The problem with very, very stringent targets is we need those technologies immediately, and they're just not there. So what happens is you go to lesser targets is you have more time to develop better technologies. So when you start to really invest heavily into this program, at least you have good tools available to you. As you drop further down and start being willing to accept more and more warming, what happens is the costs drop dramatically. So why is that? It's partly because you have time to develop the new technologies you want, and partly because you're not actually investing as much in reducing these technologies. So more or less, as you go from 3 degrees, as you go to 4 degrees, you go to 6 degrees, what's going to happen is your costs drop by an order of magnitude. So it's not whether we want to spend any money on this problem. We certainly ought to do the cheap things to try to reduce greenhouse gases, because it's not going to cost us very much. We're going to hardly notice this thing at all. What we don't want to do is spend vast amounts of money to go at very, very strict targets, because it's going to cost a lot of resources. It's going to cost many trillions of dollars, several trillions of dollars, to do severe targets. Now, the question is, what do you get? If you go after severe targets, what are the benefits that you get from doing this? Obviously, you get avoided damages, damages which would otherwise occur if we do nothing at all. The question is, what are they? If we look at the last IPCC report that actually tried to do the economics of this, that was the 96 report. That was the second assessment. It turns out that at that point, they argued that a doubling of CO2 would lead to something like a 1.5% increase in damages. Damages equal to 1.5% of GDP, something by 2100. So it turns out that what that means is you're going to get hundreds of billions of dollars of benefits, but you're going to have to spend many trillions of dollars to get it. In other words, there's an order of magnitude difference between the benefits that you're going to get and the costs of this program. Another way of putting it is you're going to get about 10 cents out of the dollar you spend on this. That's according to their own estimates, the IPCC estimates that they generated in 96. So they're a little old, those estimates. What's true about the new estimates? What have we learned about this problem over the last 15 years? And it turns out we've learned that the original estimates were probably too high. And they were too high for several reasons. One is that they only looked at damages. The fact that climate change may cause some benefits in some places in the world, they overlooked it. And it turns out we now know that that's certainly going to happen. Another thing they ignored is they ignored the idea there would be adaptation. They assumed that if you're a farmer and you're growing a crop that doesn't grow anymore, that you would still grow it over and over again. Having it fail once, twice, 50 years in a row, you'd still grow that same crop. We kind of have guessed that by now that probably farmers are smarter than that. And that idea of private adaptation, the idea that farmers may in fact do something about this, that we all will do things about it, that we will all adjust to this warmer world, that was completely ignored in the early analyses. What that means, if we adjust, it means the damages aren't going to be as bad as people originally thought. So adaptations turned out to be an important thing that was originally ignored. So what else has been a problem? The early analyses were all done on the 1990 economy, the economy that existed when these studies first started. The fact is climate change isn't going to happen in 1990. It's going to happen in 2060. It's going to happen in 2100. It's going to happen in some future economy. It's the future economy that we have to be studying. And most of the sectors that are very climate sensitive will be smaller as a fraction of GDP in the future. So as a fraction of GDP, we'll be less vulnerable than we are right now. That's true in the United States, but it's even more true in the places we're most worried about, which is in the low latitudes, where most of the damages will probably occur. What else is true? Some of the sectors are dynamic in nature. They have big capital stocks. It's very hard for them to adjust quickly. The early models had a hard time dealing with those dynamic models, and so they didn't do a very good job of trying to explain how those damages would gradually unfold over a century. And they kind of did some techniques which tried to, they tended to make you think these were much more serious sectors than we actually thought. So the sea level rise is a perfect example. They kind of looked at sea level rise and said, over a century, the seas are going to rise, therefore we're going to have to build all these seawalls. If we built them all today, that would be really expensive. But of course, we don't need to build them all today. We have an entire century to build seawalls. You could actually build seawalls gradually as you redevelop properties just by building the new property, each new property 1 meter higher than you built the last one. You would actually adjust completely to sea level rise. You probably wouldn't even know you've done it. So the actual costs of doing these dynamic programs aren't nearly as expensive as the original studies suggested. So what does that mean? It means that if you actually go after very severe targets, your cost-benefit ratio looks terrible. You're really not going to get much money in return for it. So when you look at targets which are less than 3.5 degrees, it turns out they're going to cost an awful lot of money, but the benefits you're going to get back are going to be very small in comparison. On the other hand, if you let this problem go completely, you don't even spend small amounts of money to try to control it, you're going to find yourself eventually in warming that's greater than 3.5 degrees. Sooner or later, whether it happens this century, it happens the next century, sooner or later we're going to have enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that you're running a serious risk that you're going to see some very large warming. It's cheap to prevent that from happening. It's cheap to do it for a target of 3.5 degrees, 4 degrees. It's inexpensive. All you're doing is just saying we're not going to go overboard with fossil fuels. It won't cost very much. But what you're avoiding is the top end of this climate change. And on the top end of this climate change, very bad things can happen. So although 2 to 3 degrees may not cause very much of severe damages in the world, when you start to talk about 4, 5, 6 degrees warming, you are going to see some things you'd just rather not see. You are going to start seeing very high levels of sea level rise. You are going to start seeing things which you're seeing huge amounts of crop damage. You are going to start seeing large amounts of ecological damages, things that you just don't want to see, that are going to be catastrophes. You want to avoid those catastrophes, and basically it's easy to do it. So my own argument is not that it's climate change or nothing. My own argument is that you really want to be thinking about moderate amounts of regulation, cheap things, things that we all can afford that are not going to in fact slow down the economy. So what's the conclusion? My sense is that we know enough about the climate science that we do want to regulate. We want to regulate, we want to start. We don't want to start with some crash program that's going to completely upend the economy. We want to start with something that's so modest, it's going to be a joke. I mean, back when Clinton was first saying, well, let's raise the gasoline tax 10 cents. And everybody said, oh, God, gasoline prices go from $1.50 to $1.60. We die. There's no way this economy could survive that. Well, obviously we can survive a 10-cent increase in gasoline. That's a modest increase. We can handle very modest regulations. What the world needs is to get started on this problem, and it gets started with a modest effort. And what we need is to get full cooperation in a modest effort. It's actually easy to get full cooperation if you're doing something that everybody can afford. Even China, India, they all can afford a modest regulation. You get that universal participation, you start. My sense is that's important to start. But the point is we want to avoid doing something which is dramatic, that takes us out of rational thought, that starts to be an overreaction to this problem and might make things worse. You want to avoid those stringent regulations. We don't need them. They're probably going to be terribly ineffective. They're certainly going to be politically ineffective. The economics actually is going to guide you into a very moderate and sensible long-run policy. So my personal thing is we should start something efficient, something universal, something that we all, in fact, can achieve. Thank you.